So Angela, over to you.
Okay. I was just thinking the first time I was in Manchester to speak at an event, I was actually speaking about almost exactly this topic. It was something like 5 years ago, I think. But the panel was on the subject of counterculture and the political usefulness of counterculture. And I was saying, actually, there is a kind of emerging counterculture online, and you won't like it when it starts to have a lot more influence than it already does. So I was talking about kind of the culture of 4chan and stuff like that. So the research for this book originally started about online anti-feminist forums and kind of subcultures. And um, at the time, the thing that made them interesting to me was the fact that they didn't really resemble traditional anti-feminist politics, in that they weren't really Christian or conservative. They didn't really have any sense of tradition, to the extent that they would even refer to a kind of more traditional gender roles. It was like to troll kind of like easily offended people and stuff like that. So it was very much about kind of enjoying the fun of being irreverent and to make fun of the easily offended and stuff like that. So it very much resembled kind of it had a kind of punk sensibility, if you like, and it had a kind of countercultural sensibility. So I just had a feeling that that was going to be something that was going to be very influential. Um, and particularly the kind of culture around 4chan at the time. But the thing that I was trying to think through at the time also was the fact that I would go and, the kind of anti-feminist politics that was on, say, the red pill and stuff like that was interesting, but I felt the most creative stuff was coming from 4chan, so that's the one that I was looking at the most. And so I would go to, say, and I would see, absolutely horrible stuff, sort of like traumatically horrible stuff. And then I would read people in academia and people, ostensibly progressive people talking about 4chan and the kind of cultures that were coming from 4chan as something libertarian and progressive and something generally positive. So in academia, for example, where certainly in the humanities, there is a kind of a, liberal kind of hegemony, if you like. But why I was wondering is that on this one forum, everything is permissible. Whereas if some sort of like nice, harmless conservative said, maybe the family is okay, they'd be sort of booted out. But if you say, whatever the most like gruesome misogynist kind of stuff that was on 4chan was fine. So I was kind of trying to work through why that is and what kind of strange biases were at work among kind of progressive people that meant that misogyny in that form was acceptable and much milder forms of it elsewhere were not. And so I guess I was thinking that it was because of that sense that if it's countercultural, it must be left wing. If it's countercultural, it must be progressive. At that point, I mean, now that's so obviously not the case, but at that point, I think people were still clinging on to that kind of idea that the right can't possibly be countercultural, and the right cannot be transgressive, and so on. That is the kind of the thing that the left does well. And so in a way, that kind of culture was mistaken for something it wasn't. There is a kind of a theory that there was a different 4chan back then, and that there was a kind of a moment where the politics of it changed. And I've kind of really argued against that, because I think that the seeds of what it became were there from the very beginning. It was always about ritualized cruelty against the weak, where they would bully sort of like one teenage girl and stuff like that. It was more complicated than that, but that was in there for sure. It was very much about the enjoyment of humiliation of people and all these quite sadistic kind of group activities, that there was kind of pleasure in engaging in these together. So it's not actually that hard to see sort of how you end up flirting with kind of fascism and with, sort of dehumanizing people who are, drowning in the sea and stuff like that. That it's that kind of aestheticizing cruelty that was there from the very beginning, before it had kind of formal politics. Another thing that was happening at the time, one of the reasons why there was this blindness to it, I think, was that it was that kind of very cyber utopian sort of moment where you had the Arab Spring and you had the Occupy movement, and everyone was writing about how the internet was going to democratize culture and democratize media, and it was going to bring in this new age of everyone participating, and all the kind of legacy media, or the old media, if you like, was going to be torn down. Now, if you fast forward to now, in a way that has happened, but it's been a right-wing phenomenon primarily. So, I mean, who do you think of now when, if you think of somebody saying like the media is full of lies and it's all manipulation, you're more likely to think of Donald Trump than Noam Chomsky now. And even I was thinking, when I was an undergrad, if you were on the left, you were probably part of the anti-globalization movement, whereas now you might think of like globalism and so on as something that the right talks about. So that kind of suspicion of the media, suspicion of globalism. I know they're slightly different ideas, but there is a strange kind of a similarity in a way. And the way I ended up kind of trying to theorize it in the book was kind of two ways. One was some interesting stuff that was written about subcultures, kind of music subcultures, which I went back and looked at. And obviously they were all sort of pre-internet, but a lot of them, there were certain interesting parallels. So, I referenced Sarah Thornton, who wrote this kind of very good critique, Angela McRobbie did as well, of the way in which subcultures had been written about by people who were biased toward the subcultures, or they liked the subcultures, so they wanted to believe that they were politically progressive. So everything they did suddenly became resistance, and it was a very generous kind of an interpretation of subcultures. And she was kind of saying, actually, no, there are all of these other things going on in subcultures. They're incredibly elitist, for example. They're incredibly contemptuous of mainstream society. And there are all these other kind of things at work. They police the boundaries of the subculture by hating people who are on the outside, by being, elitist in terms of whatever it is, wearing the right clothes, using the right language. In the case of internet subcultures, it's very much about knowing the right kind of slang and, knowing all the obscure references and stuff like that. And that is kind of how they cohere themselves in some way, by hatred of people who are outside of the subculture. So, I mean, I'm not going to go through the whole book in a way, because if you're here, you've probably either read it or heard some kind of a synopsis of it. But instead, I will say a few words about what has happened since. Because in the closing of the book, I was saying, this has the potential to go into the real world and not just be an online phenomenon. Because at that time, the riots in Berkeley had just happened over a Milo Yiannopoulos talk. And that has certainly happened since. There's obviously been, an attempt to bring it all into real life. The most far-right elements of it have, in a way, capitalized the most and have become the most prominent since, because they have a coherent political worldview. The others, who are just sort of trolling, or who are sort of alt-light, who don't really know what they believe in many cases, just couldn't keep up basically with the far right kind of core of it, if you like, who had thought through their ideas and so on. So obviously you had Charlottesville, where a protester was killed, and it all became a lot more serious, because people who thought that it was maybe funny, or it was partly a joke, or there was any element of irony or playfulness in it, were suddenly faced with the reality of what it really is politically, or at least what that serious political core of it is about. And for years, if you talked about the alt-right or any kind of online, let's say, reactionary movements, you were always told that you didn't get the joke, that it was ironic. And pretty much right up until Charlottesville, people continued to say that. And now nobody can really say that with a straight face, because it got very serious, and people who were researching it kind of showed, what the political kind of component of it, the serious political component of it, have been saying for years. So, for example, openly saying, you may not like the alt-right brand, but we can't say white nationalists, so just say that. And, that's what they say amongst themselves. In terms of what has happened in reaction to the book, I was just saying to Cheryl, I feel I need to reread the book because I've been having arguments about a book that I didn't write for months, arguments that I didn't actually make. And I even see sometimes people who like the book and people who hate the book sort of battling each other online. And the people who like the book are even arguing the case for things I didn't actually say because they're trying to defend me against the other people. But the strange outcome of it, which I genuinely didn't expect, and I even dread to say this because if I say it, it will be seized upon as evidence of my secret reactionary politics or something like that. But it is true that I haven't got the bad reaction from the alt-right that I was expecting. I did lots of, online security stuff, and I had many sleepless nights worrying about what would happen if my email was hacked, or, I imagined all the sort of horrible videos that they would make and so on. And that actually hasn't really happened, strangely. I'm always waiting for it. It doesn't quite happen. So I remember somebody said when the book first came out on Twitter that like Nagle and the alt-right are like Clarice Starling and Hannibal Lecter. They won't attack her. They'd consider it rude, which has actually turned out to be true. But the main kind of group of people that I've received most attacks from have been kind of on the left, pretty much, and they've been a mixture of. Well, I mean, I won't be kind because they haven't been nice to me. So they've been a mixture of like very cretinous, kind of like anarchist, liberal, sort of radical people, and some of them have been kind of like trots with sort of terrible blogs who have been like left behind by the Corbyn and Bernie thing, and they're sort of left behind, but they've still got their blogs, so they have to they have to make sure that they have to attack anything that has any popular appeal whatsoever. So they have their boycott any popular left-wing magazine campaigns, and their boycott any popular left-wing writer campaigns, and so on. And yeah, so I that was disappointing in a way, but also not, because there was a there was a kind of wave of nice reviews, from all over the place, but from kind of writers on the left who I respect and who are good. And then there was the backlash. Then I think there's a bit of a backlash against the backlash, so that people who like the book really like it and have even been kind of defending it online. So thank you if you're one of those people. So I guess I will just say a few things about why the alt-right have appeal. And here I'm not really talking about all the various kind of little micro subcultures I was looking at online. I'm really talking about the actual alt-right, if you like, the far right that was there kind of within the alt-right, or the new far right, or whatever you want to call it. I think that part of their appeal, and why I think that those who find themselves now opposing them, but trying to use some of their ideas, what are sometimes called the alt-light, I think that they are not going to succeed in actually opposing them, because their ideas are just too weak right now. I think that the alt-right appeal to people because there is, certainly in the online world, for younger people who kind of came of age online and were politicized online, certain kind of the de-anonymized internet, if you like, the social media where your name is attached and where you have to, put your name to everything you say, and particularly the kind of, I guess, liberal kind of social media world became a kind of place where you could one badly phrased, insensitively phrased tweet and your life could be over, basically, or your social life, certainly your career, maybe even. And, it became very prone to groupthink and censorship and very humorless and very scolding and not very much fun. And the alt-right was a kind of a haven for people who wanted to go in and be anonymous and say whatever kind of taboo stuff they wanted to say. We know that, while there is a kind of a polite layer of you might call it political correctness or whatever, a certain etiquette that we have, that, beneath that there are kind of reactionary views that are kind of under the surface and that are not being talked about. Whether they should be talked about, or whether is another question, because I'm actually in favor of certain kinds of um, parameters of, like, politeness, I guess, and stuff like that. I don't think that I don't want to listen to Milo Yiannopoulos all the time, or I don't want to have to discuss whether the Holocaust happened or not all the time. So we all have some kind of, and actually, interestingly, some people have commented on this before, but I think it bears repeating. When Milo Yiannopoulos, the videos came out of him defending relationships between adults and kind of early teen or preteen boys, those on the right who were always claiming to defend freedom of speech got rid of him instantly, and they made no apologies about getting rid of him because they found his idea offensive, and it was, after all, just an idea. So I think that when people on the left say the right are not really in favor of freedom of speech, they're just being opportunistic. That's true. I think that given half the chance, they would certainly not allow any kind of dissent, or they would get rid of their opponents. I think part of their appeal is also a kind of collectivism. That is something they talk about a lot, and it's sort of implicit in a lot of their language, and that they reject kind of essentially liberal individualism, and they are radical in the sense that they are going to the very root of that, and they're rejecting it, at that very basic level. I think that uh, every idea has a kind of cycle where it at some point has energy, lots of intellectual energy behind it, and then at a certain point it becomes kind of flabby because it hasn't had to defend itself in a really long time. And I think kind of liberal individualism is at that point now, where just last night I was watching the debate between Jacobin and Reason magazine, and it was amazing how much stronger the Jacobin side were, in my opinion, anyway. And the arguments that the people from Reason were making, which were very much in favor of a total kind of individualism, felt incredibly weak to me. They sounded incredibly weak, and that wouldn't have been the case even, say, 5 to 10 years ago. I think that it used to be that people, even though I've always disagreed with them, people making free market arguments were sharp, and they had their arguments kind of very sharpened, and they were always ready for debate. But now, increasingly, I think that feels like it's dying, like it doesn't have kind of much energy to it. And I think younger people are also starting to feel like many, the world that they sort of have only ever known, which is the one that is created by that kind of liberal individualist culture, is falling apart in a way because the very idea of progress is being questioned, I think, by younger people, by millennials and so on. In modernity, you kind of lose everything, and the only thing you gain is material progress, which is no small thing. It means you don't die in childbirth and all kinds of good stuff like that, but you do lose everything in the process. You lose traditional cultures, you lose indigenous cultures, you lose languages, you lose everything. And when progress stops kind of delivering on the material grounds, which it doesn't anymore for younger people, most of us cannot have the basic things that our parents had, like a house, or any kind of stable job or anything like that. And so when those things stop delivering, I think people start to look around and say, what is all of this for? What maybe we could look at the world differently. So I think that progress, individualism, all those things are being questioned in really fundamental ways. I mean, the part of the alt-right's appeal is obviously just totally sinister, in my opinion. It really is about, the strong convincing themselves that they are actually the victims, so they can morally justify attacking people who are actually in a vulnerable position. And all of that. So I'm not saying this as we have to feel bad for them or anything like that, but I do think that the broader kind of backdrop of what people who are sort of a bit older find totally baffling, like why are younger people all attaching themselves to these crazy kind of radical ideologies all of a sudden on the left as well. I think it is because those kind of end of history, kind of settled, what we thought were settled ideas are all kind of falling apart now.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you very much, Angela.